So throughout the 80s and 90s, nobody spent much money looking for oil or opening mines or expanding agricultural lands. In fact, farmers around the world were going bankrupt during the 80s and 90s, and they were having charitable drives to bail out farmers everywhere. Well, that meant, of course, that if productive capacity is not being added to, that supply is going down. Throughout the 80s and 90s, supply of everything declined, but also throughout the 80s and 90s, the demand for everything was growing. You know what happened to the world. For those of you who know what's been happening in Asia in the past 30 years, you know the 3 billion people in Asia are now trying to live like we live in the United States or like people live in Europe. They want to live the same way. I mean, they've all seen TV now. They know how we live, and they want to aspire to the same things. In the 1970s, the last time we had a bull market in commodities, Asia was not involved. Mao Zedong was still running China in the 1970s. Indira Gandhi and Nehru were ruining India in the 1970s. East and West Pakistan had just split. Vietnam had been destroyed by war. So you had 3 billion people out here in Asia who basically were at subsistence level from economies, most of them. That's all changed. So you have huge demand growth, plus, of course, America and Europe and most of the rest of the world, too, has grown since the 1970s. So you had demand growing for 30 years. You had virtually nobody adding to supply for 30 years. So, and, you know, mines deplete. Oil fields deplete, and they were depleting. There's been no oil field, major elephant oil field, discovered in over 40 years. All the great oil fields in the world are in decline. The North Sea is in decline. The UK is now importing oil after exporting oil for 25 years. Alaska's in decline. Mexico's in rapid decline. Malaysia, our neighbors here in Singapore, have been a great oil exporter for decades. Within the decade, they will be importing oil. Indonesia is a member of OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Indonesia is getting thrown out of OPEC because Indonesia now imports oil. One of the great oil exporting nations of the world is now an importer. 10 years ago, China was a major exporter of oil. Now they're second largest importer in the world. So with mines depleting, oil fields depleting, everything down as far as production is concerned, demand growing, that's called a bull market. Well, I could give you the stories about 100, 150 countries where I've crossed the borders and the experiences of what they've led to. Speaking of which, the one that comes to mind is Botswana. Back when I went around the world on my motorcycle, Botswana was an unknown country. It still is pretty unknown for most people. There are only 1 million or so, maybe 2 million people by now in Botswana. But when I first got to Botswana, I had driven down through the center of Africa, had all sorts of experiences, some good, some bad. But when I got to Botswana, I mean, it was suddenly, I thought I didn't know where I was, because here was a very efficient and crisp border crossing, no black market, no anything, real highways, real shopping centers. I got real signs, road signs telling you where to go and how far it was. And I got to the capital city, and there were real traffic lights, real street signs, real hotels. And by then I realized I had stumbled onto something. I did go down to inquire whether there was a stock exchange, and did more homework. There was a stock exchange, and I did more homework, and I found out that Botswana had a balanced budget every year since independence. It had been independent 25 years at that point. Every year it had a balanced budget. Every year it had a balanced positive trade balance every year for 25 years. I said, my gosh, where am I? What is this place? You know, America at that time had run up gigantic deficits for year after year after year, both budget deficits and trade deficits, as had much of the world. So I went down to the stock exchange and opened an account. And I was so impressed with the country that I bought shares in every company on the Botswana Stock Exchange. Now, lest you start thinking that I'm some kind of big hitter, there were only 7 companies listed on the stock exchange at the time. But I did buy shares in all 7 of them. Over the years, more companies came public, as you can imagine. Many of the companies had rights issues and new issues. And I continued to invest in Botswana up until about 2007, 2006 or 7, when I sold out all of my shares in all of the emerging markets around the world where I'd been investing for some of them 30 years, except China. I did not sell China. So that's the kind of experience you can have if you do travel. It certainly taught me a lot about Botswana. I made a lot of money, certainly a gigantic amount of money percentage-wise, investing in Botswana. So what I suggest you all do is get on your motorcycle, get your girlfriend or your boyfriend, and take off around the world. Well, in the agriculture business, it's been such a horrible business, we have a shortage of everything. I mean, for the last 30 years, you now have shortages of fertilizer and seeds and you have shortages of tractor tires even now because it's been a terrible business and nobody's invested. You have a shortage of farmers. Most farmers in the world are old men because it's been such a terrible business. All these agricultural and mining schools are going to be full of people because that's where the next great professions are going to be. Farming is going to be one of the great businesses, sectors, professions of the next 30 years. Go and get yourself a mining degree if you don't want to be a farmer, because that's where the great fortunes are going to be made in the next 10, 20, 30 years. The paper shuffling on Wall Street is finished, and the City of London. Throughout history, we've had major shifts when we've had long periods when the financial community has been the center of the world. You've also had long periods when the agriculture or mine, the people who produce real goods have been the center of the world. Well, we're now in a period of gigantic shift where we're shifting from the financial types to the people who produce the real goods. And for the next 20 or 30 years, it's going to be those people who are going to be in charge.